At times of remembrance, we often tend to think about those who gave their lives from our family, or our town, our workplace, or our school. Here I'll talk about a small group of 20 young men who all died as aircrew on operations during the Second World War, who had all been at the same school. Inside Borden Grammar School here in Sittingbourne, one honours board specifically lists those believed to have died during the Second World War over 80 years ago. There are no less than 59 names on this board. To be clear, many hundreds of old Bordenians, as they are known, must have flown or served as aircrew during the Second World War. But here we remember those that lost their lives. Of the 59 names for whom links have been found to the school, 16 have been added following relatively recent research. Only 31 were known about during the war, and 12 more came to light in the decade following the end of the war, making 43. Of these, 19 had served as aircrew in the RAF and 1 with the Fleet Air Arm. But, you might think surprisingly, not a fighter pilot amongst them. No, these were virtually all bomber crew. Although the nation was under pressure, selection for aircrew was fairly rigorous, and the engineering, mathematical and scientific education and the sports background which these men had received must have suited them for the roles of pilot, navigator, wireless operator, flight engineer, bomb aimer or air gunner. 3 old Bordenians died in 1941 whilst serving as aircrew with the RAF. But the first aircrew death I can find is the only Fleet Air Arm member on our list. Leslie Martin Herbert was born in 1917 and lived on the Isle of Sheppey. Leslie attended Borden Grammar School and continued into the 6th form, where he excelled at sport, swimming, cricket and cross-country running in particular. When he left in about 1935, he went to work for Rowntree's Confectionery. At the start of the war, he joined the Fleet Air Arm and was part of 814 Squadron operating from HMS Hermes in the Indian Ocean, flying in Swordfish aircraft. Sub-Lieutenant Herbert was involved in an accident during flying operations in May 1941 and lost his life at the age of 24. Edward Robert Ingram was also born in 1917. When the family moved to Kent, Edward attended Borden Grammar School. He passed his school certificate in the summer of 1934. After joining the RAF, he was posted to No. 78 Squadron, flying Armstrong Whitworth Whitley aircraft as part of Bomber Command. Based in County Durham, the squadron was part of a raid on Bremen in June 1941. Sergeant Edward Ingram's aircraft was shot down and all the crew were killed. Edward was 24 years old and has no known grave. Noel Sidney Wilson was born in 1920. When Noel attended Borden Grammar, he lived in Minster on the Isle of Sheppey. During the war, Noel Wilson served in the RAF, training as a wireless operator and an air gunner, attaining the rank of sergeant. He was posted to No. 40 Squadron, flying in Wellington bombers from a base in Cambridgeshire. In June 1941, Noel was flying as a wireless operator on a raid over Dusseldorf. His aircraft was brought down by enemy action and crashed east of Eindhoven, southern Netherlands, killing all 6 members of the crew. Noel Wilson was 22 years old. He's buried in the Netherlands. Stanley William Dane was born in 1918. He was one of the few boys to gain a scholarship and entered Borden Grammar School in September 1929. The family lived in St George's Avenue, Sheerness. By 1941, Sergeant Dane was a pilot for No. 149 Squadron, based at Mildenhall, flying Wellington bombers. Stanley had completed over 28 successful raids when, on the night of the 7th and 8th of November 1941, he was part of a large raid on Berlin. Stanley's aircraft was brought down and 5 crew members were killed. Stanley was 23 years old and is buried in Germany. During 1942, 5 more old Bordenians lost their lives whilst serving as aircrew. Bryden Grange Seago, known as Bill, was born in 1918. He lived at Robmesham Green near Sittingbourne. Whilst at Borden Grammar School, he was a strong academic and won many prizes. When he left school, Bill started working for Lloyd's Bank, but in June 1940 he joined the RAF. He married his fiancée early in 1942. Bill joined No. 44 Squadron, flying in Lancasters as a wireless operator and air gunner with the rank of sergeant. In April 1942, Sergeant Seago took part in a daring low-level raid on Augsburg in southern Germany, but it was tremendously costly to the squadrons that took part. Only 36 men returned safely to Waddington out of the 85 RAF personnel who had started on the raid. Bill Seago's aircraft was brought down in a ball of fire. He died aged 23 and is buried in Normandy, France. Frederick David Lloyd Oakwell was born in 1920 on the Isle of Sheppey. He attended Borden Grammar School in the 1930s. He trained as an air gunner and wireless operator in the RAF. In May 1942, Flight Sergeant Oakwell was with No. 86 Squadron based at Wick when he took off in a Bristol Beaufort for a raid on a target in Norway. His aircraft was shot down over the target and Frederick was killed at the age of 21. He was buried at Solar Churchyard in Norway. Brian Alfred Carter Richards was born in 1920. Brian came from an affluent and well-respected family who lived in Bredgar. Brian attended Borden Grammar School where he excelled at sport. He was a gifted cricketer and played for Gore Court after he left school. He became an engineer like his father. But at the outbreak of war, Brian joined the RAF and became a pilot in No. 7 Squadron flying short Stirling bombers. He flew in the famous 1000 bomber raids of 1942. In June 1942, Pilot Officer Richards departed Oakington, Cambridgeshire for a raid over Bremen. However, his Stirling bomber was hit and suffered severe damage. During the enemy attack and in the immediate aftermath of it, Brian was able to control his aircraft sufficiently for 3 of the crew to escape, but the plane crashed into the sea off Borkum Island. Brian's body was washed ashore on the Dutch mainland 2 weeks later. Brian was just 21 when he died and is buried in the Netherlands. Geoffrey Francis Stevens was born in 1921. Geoffrey attended Borden Grammar School when the family lived reasonably close by on London Road, Sittingbourne. He volunteered for the RAF and trained as a wireless operator and navigator with the rank of sergeant. He joined No. 12 Squadron, part of Bomber Command, flying Wellington bombers from a base in Lincolnshire. He flew as a navigator in one of the first 1000 bomber raids, but setting off for a raid in July 1942, his aircraft crashed on takeoff and all the crew were killed. Geoffrey Stevens was buried, aged 21 years old, in the local churchyard in Lincolnshire. James Alfred Wildish, born in 1914 in the Sittingbourne area, James won a free place scholarship to Borden Grammar School in 1926. His family lived in Chalkhill Road. He married in 1938 and settled in Staplehurst Road and had a son born in 1939. By 1942, James was flying in Wellington bomber aircraft with No. 115 Squadron with the rank of sergeant. In October 1942, James was one of the crew of a Wellington that departed Mildenhall on a daylight raid to Essen. The aircraft was brought down by enemy action and James died, aged 28 years, along with all the crew. During 1943, 6 further old Bordenians died whilst serving as aircrew. Leopold Alexander was born in 1912. His father ran a grocery in Bredgar. Leo attended Borden Grammar School when it was still in College Road. In February 1941 he married and had a son born in 1943. Joining the RAF he became an air gunner and attained the rank of sergeant, flying on Lancasters with No. 49 Squadron stationed in Lincolnshire. In February 1943, on a raid over Cologne, his aircraft was brought down near Kessel in the Netherlands. Alexander died aged 30 and is buried in the Netherlands. David Joseph Hobson was born in 1922 and the family lived in Briar Road. He left Borden Grammar School in 1938 at the age of 16 and went to work for Harris & Harris, the solicitors. At the outbreak of war, he volunteered for the RAF and was eventually commissioned, flying Stirling bombers as a pilot with No. 15 Squadron based in Cambridgeshire. In February 1943, Flying Officer Hobson took off on a raid over Wilhelmshaven. His plane was brought down and crashed in flames over the island of Ameland. David was 20 years old and is buried in the Netherlands. Stanley Gordon Hookway was born in 1916 and attended Borden Grammar School from the age of 15 until he was 18. He was known as an outstanding cricketer. Stanley enlisted in the RAF before the war began and became a pilot. He married in 1939 and had a son. By 1940, he was flying with 51 Squadron and was awarded the DFC in 1941. He transferred to 156 Squadron as part of the Pathfinder Force, flying Wellingtons and then Lancasters. He became a wing commander in 1943, but in March of that year, his aircraft failed to return from a raid over Essen. He was buried, aged 26, in Germany. Roger Leslie Hodgson was born in 1911. The family lived at Queenborough and he left Borden Grammar School in 1929. At the outbreak of war, he joined the RAF and became an air gunner with 101 Squadron, flying in Wellingtons and then Lancasters from a base in Yorkshire. In April 1943, his aircraft was brought down over Essen and all 7 crew members were killed. Roger was 31 years old and is buried in Germany. John Lester was born in 1919 and the family moved to Sittingbourne in the 1920s. He attended Borden Grammar School in the 1930s. He served with 44 Squadron as a sergeant, flying Lancasters from Waddington in Lincolnshire. In May 1943, his aircraft failed to return and all 7 crew members were killed. There is no known grave. John was 24 years old. Alan Wood was born in 1921. The family lived in Sheerness. He left Borden Grammar School in 1937 and volunteered soon after for the RAF. He was eventually commissioned and flew with No. 47 Squadron as part of Overseas Command, flying Beaufighters in support of the Allied effort in southern Europe. Flying from Libya in November 1943, his aircraft was reported missing. He was 22 years old. During 1944, there were 3 more. Lawrence Wilfrid Granston was the second of 3 brothers to die in the conflict. Their father ran a coal merchant's in Sittingbourne. Lawrence was born in 1921 and attended Borden Grammar School, leaving before the outbreak of war. He joined the RAF and was known to be serving as a navigator in 1942. Sergeant Granston was with 20 OTU undergoing training at Lossiemouth in January 1944 when his Wellington was involved in an accident. He died aged 22 and is buried in Sittingbourne Cemetery. Douglas Arthur Cole was born in 1923 and the family lived in Chalkwell Road. He started at Borden Grammar School in 1934 where he excelled at sport. He left in 1939 but returned briefly as a laboratory assistant. He then joined the local NatWest Bank but joined the RAF in 1942, becoming a navigator with the rank of flight sergeant. He was with No. 77 Squadron flying in a Halifax in March 1944 when his aircraft was lost over France. He was 20 years old and is buried in northern France. James William Morris was born in 1923 and the family lived in Halfway, Sheerness. He left Borden Grammar School at the age of 16 in 1939 and he soon volunteered for the RAF. He trained as a bomb aimer and attained the rank of flight sergeant with 61 Squadron flying Lancasters from a base in Lincolnshire. In September 1944, during a raid on Calais, he died when his plane was brought down. He was 21 years old and there is no known grave. And then 2 more during 1945. Ronald Hadlow was born in 1922 and the family lived on the Isle of Sheppey. After leaving Borden Grammar School in the late 1930s, he married in 1942 and lived at Halfway. He volunteered for the RAF and attained the rank of Flight Sergeant, serving with 224 Squadron Coastal Command, flying Liberators on anti-submarine patrols. In February 1945, his Liberator aircraft was on a mission over Norway, but it failed to return. He was 22 years old. Geoffrey Westacott was born in 1923. The family lived in Sheerness. He left Borden Grammar School in 1939 and volunteered for the RAF. He became a navigator with the rank of Flight Sergeant, flying Lancasters with No. 50 Squadron. In April 1945, flying from a base in Lincolnshire, all crew were killed when the aircraft was brought down over Hamburg during a daylight raid. Geoffrey was 21 years old and is buried in Hamburg. These 20 men are just a fraction of those who have given their lives over the years. Their average age was 23. The information in this video was taken from this book, written by the late Sally Jenkins in 2015 and published by Sittingbourne Heritage Museum.
If you have found this video interesting, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or visit our website.